pentagram dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal force and the dawn of terrestrial birth, man mastered the mammoth and horse, and man was the lord of the earth. He made him an hollow skin from the heart of an holy tree. He compassed the earth therein, and man was the lord of the sea. He controlled the vigorous steam. He harnessed the lightning for hire. He drove the celestial team, and man was the lord of the fire. Streets mouthed from their thrones.
Well, here we are, the big 6-0. It seemed only recently that we reached the big 5-0. Well, I suppose that's what happens, isn't it? Yes, indeed, the big 6-0. 60 episodes. Who knew that when we started there would be 60 episodes to catalogue my descent into insanity, my descent into nonsensical meanderings every week, every Friday. Yes, well, indeed. I'm Alan Averill. This is Agitators Anonymous, episode 60. Let's keep trucking. Let's keep rolling. Circle the wagons. Let's do it. The last episode was a little bit about, I suppose it was a bit about punk rock, cancel culture, a bit about me living as a teenage vampire in a Wasp video. All sorts of things like that. A bit more about music and a bit more about rock. But I said it would be part one of a maybe two-part ramble about a little bit about the 80s, about music culture and how it changed and shifted. And, well, let's get into it. Yes, indeed, the big 6-0. Kind of reminds me of this one time I was DJing in Dublin, and always was what you would call a t-shirt elitist, and had an old Venom t-shirt from 1985, tour with Exodus, back, on the back, dates on the back, world possession tour Venom. Very proud of it I was. And I was busy fixing some wires underneath the DJ booth, and some girl tapped me on the shoulder. And the first thing she said was, 1985? That means you must be about 50. Horror and disgust at the realization that your old elitist t-shirts age you. Well, this was when I was a little bit younger, and now that I'm approaching those ages, it seems even more utterly ridiculous. But there you go. Do you want the first print of every vinyl these days? Is that what we subscribe to? Not sure. Certainly with t-shirts, I'm quite well prepared to have aged myself by only having the original ones from the 80s, But anyway, I digress into nonsense. Yes, the big 6-0, 60 episodes. Quite the achievement, I suppose. I shall pat myself on the back for having reached that milestone as we sit through another rainy day in Dublin. This outside dining thing, yes indeed. Balmy summer's evenings in rain and cold Dublin. So what I was going to talk about was basically what happened to rock music in the mainstream. If you look on YouTube, you'll find lots of documentaries about what happened to rock music. You'll see old rockers from Angus Young and Gene Simmons. Well, actually not Angus Young, he doesn't say much, does he? But Gene Simmons and the likes saying, oh no, rock isn't dead, it never went away, etc., etc. But the reality is that, at least in the mainstream, rock music died. Or at least it has no purchase with young people. So I'm going to look at maybe why that is, what happened to rock music at the end of the 80s, and how it got supplanted by other things. But first I have to do a little ad read, which is for EISENWALD Records, up-and-coming dark post-black metal, pagan metal label, www.eisenton, EISENTON.de or .com in North America. Go there, put in the promo code ALAN, and you will get 10% off. Loads of great bands. Go and check it out. So what happened to rock music in the mainstream? Well, let's maybe go back to the 80s. And certainly, if you look up the top 100 best-selling bands or albums of all time, many of them you will find, especially once we get to the top 20, 25. There's a few anomalies, some really strange things. Soundtrack to The Bodyguard, anyone? But mainly they're white dudes with guitars. That's kind of what most of the preserve of the top 10, 20, 30 best-selling albums of all time are. They are the Eagles, they're Queens, they're Beatles, they're Rolling Stones, AC/DC, etc. Lots of things that are quite unusual and quite odd in there that you wouldn't quite consider. But yeah, take a look. We used to do this on tour all the time. We used to play the top 10 or the top 100 game, and we would sit around guessing what was, according to Wikipedia or whatever it was, the top 10 most populated cities, the top 10 countries for suicide statistics, and other such fun tour games. But the top 100 best-selling albums was always a bone of much contention. Anyway, what happened to rock? Well, I mean, if you look at the traditional hard rock of the 1970s and 1980s, in the 1980s it had its purple patch, and there was to every motley crew, I suppose, the original of the species, there was a winger, a poison, and the whole scene of 1980s rock, I think, very much mirrored the society of the time. You can look back to this whole Bonfire of the Vanities, this whole era was kind of exemplified in a lot of the movies of the time. There was definitely a sort of cocaine-fueled, we're not going to take it, America, #1, Team America kind of vibe to most of the movies of the time. Whether you're looking back on the Schwarzenegger movies or the Stallone movies, there was very much a sort of atmosphere of a kind of simplistic atmosphere of always conquering against the odds within the mainstream. And a lot of heavy metal and hard rock in the 1980s, it fascinates me that it has this, it seems to have very little self-reflection. It has very little, in thrash metal, in death metal, what's happening in the underground, maybe there is, but the mainstream hard rock, whether it's the Dockens or Cinderellas or Rats or whatever, it very much is about, at the heart of it, having a good time. And, sort of simple, basic human emotions, I suppose, joy, love, etc. There's very little dark reflection going on, and I think it mirrors the way the music industry, or rather mirrors the way the entertainment industry was at the time, and also I suppose the nascent atmosphere within society. After coming through the 1970s, there was a very much a sort of new Reaganite, Thatcherite, burgeoning middle class, as I said, Bonfire of the Vanities, cocaine-fueled middle class that just simply wanted to rage and wanted to party. Excess is good, greed is good. This whole Gordon Gekko style approach to life, this mantra. And that was very much reflected in the Poisons and the Sunset Strip bands. And in the end, I suppose they were groaning under the weight of their own excess. And it was only a matter of time before somebody came along and punctured the bubble and all of those, and deflated the balloon. And whether it was the Warrants, the Cherry Pies, very much part of this conversation, or this podcast, I've been watching those VH1 Goes Undercover kind of documentaries, and there was one with Janie Lane from Warrant, who cut a very tragic figure at the end, drank himself to death in a hotel room, who literally wrote the song Cherry Pie the night before the album came out or something, so the myth goes. Wasn't supposed to be the name of the album. The album was called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a good song, actually. I quite enjoy that song. I quite enjoy the Warrant album after that, but that's another story. Maybe I'll pair this podcast with my favourite 80s hair rock bands. But anyway, and he ended up being pilloried as the Cherry Pie guy. And he was going around the States, adjudicating cherry pie eating contests, that kind of thing. And the whole 1980s hard rock thing was groaning under the weight of its own pomposity, the weight of its own hairspray. It was a lot of fun. There's no doubt about that. And there's many things about it that now I think we could do with a little bit in music. But certainly it was groaning under the weight of its own pomposity, the weight of its own hairspray, all those kind of things, and the weight of its own ridiculousness. There was a wind of change, so to speak, sweeping through music. I think actually some of it was a delayed reaction in the United States to some of the bands that were popular in the 1970s and 1980s in the UK, the post-punk, post-wave bands, the Smiths, the Cures, the Joy Divisions, all that kind of thing. I mean, I'll get to Nirvana, Nevermind, but what people maybe don't realize is that #1, as I understand it, in the United States before Nirvana Nevermind came out, was The Cure. whatever Cure album was out at the time. It could be Head on the Door, perhaps, I'm not sure. But Depeche Mode, The Cure, Joy Division, all those kind of bands cracked the USA and became huge. And let's be honest, most of those bands have at their heart a sort of melancholy, a darkness. The Smiths, all that kind of stuff. But certainly The Cure, Depeche Mode, bands like that cracked the USA, and I think they spoke to young people in a different way that the likes of Poison and Warrant and Rat simply didn't. And I could see an element of maybe I'm connecting things that are not possible to connect, but the USA didn't really have its own indie music. I suppose there's post-wave, post-punk bands to the same degree as the UK, and the sort of melancholy and darkness at the heart of that seemed to influence the likes of the Alice in Chains, and more so than the hard rock bands. Although one could say Alice in Chains were Alice in Chains with a Z at one stage when they had big hair. So maybe I'm just connecting dots that don't need to be connected. But it would seem to me that 80s hard rock was ripe for the plucking, so to speak. It was low-hanging rotten fruit. And along came Nevermind, and along came grunge. And literally, Nevermind just swept the decks. Now, it swept the decks in a way, I suppose, for the mainstream labels. I mean, many hard rock bands in the 1990s still went on to sell 500,000 copies. And don't forget, Use Your Illusion 1 and 2 came out the same day, I think, as Nevermind, and went on to sell 20 plus million copies each. So certainly Nirvana didn't kill hard rock. MTV's decision to take Headbangers Ball off the air in the 92 or 93 certainly killed death and thrash metal in the mainstream in the USA. You can see many bands, the likes of Overkill or Testament, have albums that are selling 100 to 200,000 in the USA in the 1990s, and it just drops off a cliff somewhere when Headbangers Ball disappears. But certainly Nirvana cleared the decks more so than the sort of revisionist rhetoric that the Sex Pistols killed hard rock. I mean, if you think about that as a statement, the Sex Pistols, Nevermind the Bollocks, is what, 77, 76, 78? I should know that, shouldn't I? It's 77. Or is it 78? Well, it doesn't matter anyway. Because in 1980, you have Ace of Spades, you have Back in Black, you have Rush releasing records, you have Heaven and Hell, you have Judas Priest with British Steel. It certainly didn't kill hard rock because every single one of those records went on to sell millions. I mean, Rush sold 4 million copies of Moving Pictures in 1980 or whatever it was. So the idea that Sex Pistols killed hard rock is just untrue. But certainly Nirvana did for a lot of hard rock. In 1992, and it was clear that the winds were changing, movies were changing, mainstream entertainment was changing. People didn't want excess, they didn't want the veneer of the greed is good mantra through their music anymore. And that was one of the first sort of I suppose stepping stones towards rock being slowly removed from the mainstream culture. But it was replaced with another variant, the Soundgardens, the Pearl Jams, which were still hard rock. But anecdotally and very interestingly, I think, a friend of mine who'd worked for record labels since the early 80s, I'm going to skip through the grunge era period a little bit. I mean, there were many contributing factors as to why the things that we like, heavy metal, why that changed. And that's really because 1980s heavy metal by 92 had run out of steam. Painkiller, Triumph of Steel, and Merciful Fate in the Shadows were the triumvirate of great rock metal albums that came out in 92 for me. But really after that, it's a bit of a wasteland. The Iron Maidens, the Judas Priests, they were kind of finished. And I remember distinctly when the 1990s started, for example, with Primordial playing Circle the Tyrants and Celtic Frost and having to say, this is not Obituary, this is Celtic Frost. It was weird. That's a little microcosmic example, but it was like the 1980s had just disappeared from view completely by the time 1990 came along. And that's kind of what happened a bit to heavy metal in the mainstream as we knew it. Iron Maiden were just on the cusp of the Blaze Bayley era and all the awful records that came with that. All the old heroes had a lot of people had split up, had disappeared, and the stage was set for the Soundgardens and the Pearl Jams and all those kind of people to take over. And music kind of changed for sure. But a friend of mine, like I said, who had worked for record labels since the early 80s, he told me a very fascinating story one time. He was working in a major label in the USA. I guess it must be 93 93, 94, and I think he'd been working on the kind of dying embers, raking over the dying embers of some of the hard rock bands from the 1980s, because many of the Dockens and the Rats and these kind of bands, even Motley Crue, tried to do it. They tried to grunge down. They tried to down tune and have lots of stop-starty riffs and change their image to be a bit darker and a bit gloomier, and it just didn't work because kids didn't want a grunge album from Dokken or a grunge album from Motley Crue. They just didn't want that. They wanted the new bands, the Pearl Jams, the whatever else. And so for many 90s bands or 80s bands, there was a wilderness in the 90s. Saxon is a good example. They were in the wilderness for most of the 90s. But they hung in there in the 2000s. They got their resurgence. Same with the Def Leppards, who were one of the biggest selling bands of the 1980s, if not the biggest selling UK band, possibly in the 1980s. I'm not sure about that, but certainly up there, who by the 1990s were literally, I think, playing to 800 to 1,200 people. They were so clipped of their wings. That kind of music had been so shunned from the mainstream. But I've been trying to tell the same little mini anecdote there 3 times in a row and sidetracked myself. Well, he told me that they were sitting in a boardroom in whatever major label, somewhere in 93, 94, and a manager came in with the clipboard or the whiteboard, and this guy came in, this rapper, and they explained that this was the plan, that the new dangerous music to sell to white-class suburban kids was hip-hop and rap, and that they were going to create there and then today the backstory, how many times he was shot at, this, that, the other. They were all very clever at tying in merch deals as the end of the 90s rolled on. Not to say, of course, that there wasn't genuine hip-hop and rap music, of course. But of course, just like with hard rock in the 80s, for every classic, real hard rock band, you got the bands who were just literally, oh, right, sure, we might as well have a go at that as well. For every Dokken, there's a Poison, so to speak. Just like in the 1990s, when new metal crept in, there were lots of old hard rock musicians from the 1980s who kind of moved with the times, the Disturbs or the Mudvaynes, who were hair rock guys in the 1980s. Anyway, that's another story altogether. But this rapper dude who hadn't quite created his backstory, and his manager, they created his backstory that day within the meeting room, and they were all sworn to not discuss about it. Now, I don't know exactly who that was or how successful they were, but certainly the idea was, okay, rock now is going to take a little sidestep, and what we're going to do is introduce an element of a new danger to white middle-class suburban kids, something new and exciting. And it was all tied, he was tied into the fashion, into the I heard stories of even runner boot companies used to go out into the sort of poor areas across the United States and literally dump all the trainers out on the road and see which ones the kids liked the most. I guess it stands to reason completely. And it's not, of course, that I'm sure conversations in the 1980s happened where somebody sat down with Poison. I mean, arguably, people have said that Poison didn't even really play on their first album. I don't know if that's true or not, but they certainly weren't able to play that well live, that's for sure. However, I think that's probably a step too far, but it laid the ground for another kind of movement away from rock music. And you can see quite clearly then where new metal came out of, because new metal was the amalgamation of that sort of 90s hard rock element. Some of the musicians who were involved in the late 80s, they just moved sideways to adopt rap and hip-hop into the music, whether it was Korn, whether it was Limp Bizkit, whether it was Linkin Park, etc. And the reality is that those bands, new metal, let's say Ground Zero for new metal was 97 or 96, which is ironically the nadir of traditional heavy metal. I think the worst years for heavy metal ever are 97, 98. It's before the rebirth of the underground again, the new wave of bands that were coming out in 98, 99, all the new black metal stuff. The black metal scene of the early 1990s by this stage is kind of bloated and a bit insincere. Death metal seems to have burnt itself out after that 89 to 91 element. And so what we perceived as traditional metal was pretty much in the doldrums. And new metal came in, and it was the last really big movement within rock. Bands were selling 10, 15 million copies. Limp Bizkit probably have up to 100 million record sales behind them. And also it was the last gasp of the music industry in terms of completely owning the ball that everyone had to play with. After that, it got punctured somewhere in the mid to late 2000s, and then re-pumped up and patched over right now as most of the music industry staple labels bought their way into the streaming platforms. But that's another story. And so new metal really is the last great big selling rock movement. And then once it sort of dropped away, well, it just kept dropping and kept dropping and kept dropping to whatever we have now. It's quite complicated because the nature of what being an artist has changed drastically. And on that note, there will be the second ad read, which is metalblade.com. Use the promo code AAPodcast in North America for anything you wish to order, whether it's Cannibal Corpse to Primordial to many, many things. Go there, take a look, you get 10% off. So what happened basically is that, and this is what I've been trying to sort of work up to, is how being a musician or an artist has changed, and why rock doesn't really fit into that algorithm. And one of the first things I've got written here on my page of scribbly notes is infantilism. And this is something that I've said often in relation to other elements of society. But the idea is that once upon a time, rock music was targeted at teenagers, whereas it's very clear that Ariana Grande or Cardi B or any of this stuff, this is music targeted between 7 and 12-year-olds. There's no denying it. I mean, one can only grimly look at the example of the Manchester bombings when over 20 kids were killed at an Ariana Grande concert, and most of them were 9, 10 and 11 years old, tragically. But that is a rather grim, morbid example of the audience for pop music. Pop music moved from being about teenagers and what teenagers wanted to being infantilized, which is why an awful lot of Doja Cat or whatever, this kind of stuff. I know, who can believe I said that? Huh? Well, that's courtesy of listening to the Tim Dillon podcast that I know some of these names. This is almost like baby talk. It's infantilistic. It's preteen. It's sexualized marketing for preteens, and rock just doesn't fit into that algorithm, because every one of those, you will notice if you've walked around if you've observed the billboards on your city for the last 20 years, you'll have noticed when you see festivals coming up. We have Longitude Festival, or is it Latitude? I don't know. Who knows which one. I noticed the pop music festivals that were going 10, 15, 20 years, that the billboards changed. And they very often are just names of people. They aren't bands anymore. Because a band comes with a lot of baggage, it comes with a lot of gear, it comes with bands have guitars and blah 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 blah. DJ culture changed a lot of stuff because a DJ could literally just go with a laptop and a USB clip and away you go. And people were more interested in dancing than going to see a live band. That's a very much a 1990s, 2000s thing. The dance music tent at most festivals across the UK and Ireland would have been more packed than, for example, people watching, I don't know, a Nick Cave if he was playing at a pop style festival. And so those artists got quietly moved to the side for pop music artists. And the thing is that a band is complicated to market when it comes to Instagram or YouTube, or the fact that most modern musicians, or well, let's call them content creators, who make songs. Rock bands make albums. Pop artists, as in singular names, they make songs, because songs, and you'll notice they all cross-reference each other's names on the songs, because it's literally for 9-year-olds to play on their phone. And so what's driving many of the clicks in the algorithm for you'll notice that song, which was done by Norwegian comedians, What Does the Fox Say? This has something outrageous like nearly 1 billion plays. It's because 8-year-olds are playing it, and they're the same 8-year-olds who then, when they're 9, are playing Cardi B or whatever else. And there isn't any space for a rock band to fit into that demographic because it's purely aimed at very, very young people. But also, how does a young person identify with 5 members in a band? It just doesn't really work like that. One of the reasons why Greta Van Fleet kind of doesn't really resonate. Okay, it's just a bad rip-off of Led Zeppelin. That's a different argument. But once the music got targeted to much younger kids, then it had to become this element of infantilism. Now, it does disturb me, the fact that some of it is so graphically sexual and it's aimed at preteens, because no matter what any of these pop people say, it's mainly kids listening to them. But infantilism, rock doesn't fit into the algorithm, because right now, being an artist, or let's say musician, I mean, I suppose they're rather vague terms. It's like when we use the terms left and right now. I don't know if they're really applicable very often when people keep throwing out fascism, communism, and you go, well, these are things from the 1920s and 30s, and very different. Well, that was a rather great overreach of an example. I should have my own, I'd get the Tipex out with that one. No, what I mean is that very much a modern day pop impresario will be, of course, have a fashion range, will be doing TikTok videos, will be doing day-to-day, hourly updates on their Instagram stories. They need to have the whole thing behind them, the whole movement behind them. And that is being able to edit small videos. You'll have fashion brands associated, which is something that I think came from the hip-hop scene in the late 90s, and it was adopted by most pop people these days. And so if you're a young teenager, what seems edgy, dangerous and reckless, I suppose it's grime, something like that. It's versions of hip-hop still. It's certainly not 55-year-old chunky Axl Rose bellowing across the stage anymore. There just isn't really any danger to rock music. It's been supplanted, replaced by electronic music for quite a long time now, been replaced by hip-hop, and that's been ongoing since the 1990s. But rock became legacy, nostalgia, old people's music. And the danger that was associated with the 1970s and 1980s rock band, whether it was the Rolling Stones all the way to the Guns N' Roses, that doesn't really happen anymore. I mean, if the Foo Fighters with their saccharine sweet cloying muck, their tubs of molasses, if they are dangerous rock and roll, then rock and roll is in a perilous position. It just all moved underground. To me, that's no problem with me. I'm quite happy with heavy metal's festival culture, with it being an underground thing, but that's not really what the podcast is discussing this time. It's about why rock doesn't resonate anymore. There's also other practical and banal examples, one of which is that houses are built differently now. They don't necessarily have basements, which means that the old 1970s, you've seen it, the Detroit Rock City, band in the basement, kids, the Stranger Things guys retreat down to the basement to play their Dungeons and Dragons. Houses aren't built like that anymore. And so lots of suburbs across America didn't have that drum kit in the basement and the guys in the band and stuff like that. Rather banal, but it's true. I mean, in Ireland, we don't build houses with basements generally. And so the idea of having a rehearsal place in your basement, just never happened. And so once rehearsal rooms are removed from the cities, then, there's other banal reasons why bands, they have less places to play. Also, I suppose the gentrification of areas across big cities, whereby rent became too high for the local dive bar to be able to have rock music on a Friday. Like literally, lockdown notwithstanding, if you wanted to go and see like a rock and roll, like a proper rock and roll scuzzy, C Division Helicopters band on a Friday night in Dublin, it's pretty difficult. You can go to hot yoga on a Saturday morning and some slam poetry, but to go and see a rock and roll band at midnight, very difficult. Because usually what happens is bands have to play between 7 and 9 or 10. They get kicked out for the samba or salsa club or whatever. If there's usually, a gay club happening or something. Because venues are double booking. They want the double amounts of money every night. So the band first, club second. And there just isn't enough rock people because rock is not resonating with young people. So if you run a rock club, like I used to go to, whether it was the Cat House in Glasgow or used to go over there, it was crazy, like 1,200 people, 4 different floors, the Slime Light in London, all these kind of places. They don't really exist anymore, as I can understand, because the clientele just got a bit too old, and they weren't replaced by young people. And that even anecdotally in the rock bars in Dublin, that's kind of what happened, because rock wasn't speaking to any of these people. So kids were going to just normal dance clubs, hip hop clubs, or they were going to, as I said, samba clubs. Even on my own street, there is reggaeton clubs. Apparently that beat comes from Puerto Rico. Somebody should invade Puerto Rico and make them pay. But, that's that sort of neatly brings me to another, I suppose, reason why rock has a little bit less purchase, which is just a very simple one that most people don't really think about, and that's immigration, I suppose. I mean, that sounds really kind of odd, but as I said, rock music is the preserve of white dudes with guitars once upon a time in the 70s and 80s. The demographics of society have changed. They're just simply not the same in most places. This is not to cast no political judgment on that or in any way whatsoever, but things have changed since 1975 or even 1985 when, most of Ireland's bands were, pasty-faced suburban dudes trying to sound like U2. It seems like now, anecdotally, you go and look around for modern Dublin music and you'll find a kind of flourishing, as I said, grime scene with loads of different ethnicities in it from Dublin. And that's what speaks to young people more. And that's probably mirrored all across Europe, all across big cities, as the ethnic demographics of cities have changed. So are the other musical influences within those cities changed. For example, you could say Irish people who left in the 70s and 80s, they brought trad music with them to their countries. They brought other influences. They had their own bars, this, that, the other. So it kind of stands to reason that the old order of rock was challenged by the movement of peoples. I mean, that's just, I suppose, a state of mathematics, a state of demographics. But certainly old hard rock bands became legacy things. Things like the things that, are our home, so to speak, musically, black death metal, all that stuff, was too extreme to really challenge the mainstream. I would, of course, also maybe say something along the lines of society also changed. Society was less about heavy metal parking lot and, as I said, white dudes with guitars. Society was, I suppose, on some level, a little bit emasculated. It changed. The element of I suppose, masculinity as defined by those bands. Oddly enough, I picked Judas Priest and Heavy Metal Parking Lot, but that altered, that changed. And so the music that people wanted that reflected their state of mind, their sexuality, their way they looked at rock and roll culture also changed. Of course, there was always space for rock and roll bands. And like I said, I'm not complaining about any of these things, because I was quite happy for rock and roll to go underground. Never bothered me. People could still tour. There was lots of festivals. I mean, that's one of the things that heavy metal really, really did survive with, which was festival culture, which was touring culture. Okay, touring culture, could be a little bit down here and there because everybody had to go out and tour because nobody was selling any records or making any money from streaming. And that's one thing you notice with pop music. There's no metal band or rock band that can really compete with the streams of some of these pop people I'm talking about who are in 500 million plus range and above, because it's just 10-year-olds playing the song every day on the phone when they're on the bus or whatever. And so that has sort of left rock behind as well. But I think I want to maybe look a bit more at the whole content creation thing, because you'll notice that there are big channels on the internet that belong to musicians in metal bands and rock bands, whether it's the guy Ola Englund from The Haunted, that kind of thing. And you'll notice that he has his own band before he joined The Haunted, but The Haunted were big before he joined. He didn't make them big. But I don't know if fans of his channel will go and see The Haunted when they play live. The point was, he became big on reviewing gear on other terms, and many rock and metal bands don't have a person like that within their band. But it would suit Ola Englund to be that person if he was a solo musician or a solo artist, releasing solo music under his name, which works for pop music, works for hip-hop. If he was a hip-hop review guy, but also made amazing hip-hop on the side, it would probably work for him. But he's in the anachronistic world of being in a metal band. And I would wonder if the YouTube views he has a knock-on effect to the music that he makes. I don't think so. Because rock and metal just doesn't work within that algorithm. Rock and metal doesn't really work really within TikTok, I think. Again, you know, when you're trying to, even though I suppose, what's the word for it? I'm lost for words. Even though I'm talking about every scene and generation needing young people to breathe new life into it, I don't think that the characteristics of rock or metal really resonate with 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds, because their pop music is looking for a very young capture. But rock still relies on people being able to go to the venue, to the bar, to go and see the band live. Certainly a 9-year-old who likes a pop music, Ariana Grande, isn't going to be immersed in the social culture of rock and metal. It's not the same thing. Of course, that's a very strange sentence, but you understand what I mean. So the capture is very different. So, for example, metal and rock trying to move into TikTok just feels like, you know, the awkward uncle who's a bit too old, dressed up in the stuff that doesn't really fit at the wedding disco, trying to dance with women half his age. It just doesn't really, the square peg doesn't go into that round circle, so to speak. It just doesn't really work, because rock and metal is too analog for that digital way of moving your medium. And so, third ad read is www.hatecouture616.com. Lots of nasty and disgustingly offensive t-shirts, all sorts of things, board shorts, inverted cross bottle openers. Who wouldn't want one of them, right? Yeah, I know, exactly. Go and use the promo code ALAN. You get free shipping, which, believe me, actually counts for a lot these days. Shipping is insane. Go and have a look. So yeah, I was quite inspired by all these old VH1 docos when rock ruled the Sunset Strip and all that kind of stuff. And it just got me thinking about what happened to rock and metal in the mainstream. Can it ever come back? No, I don't think so. I mean, you've got your few ghosts and that kind of thing making waves and, you know, pulling reasonable amounts of people. But compared to really, really, really big for acts in the mainstream, I don't think so. I think the age of even boy bands and girl bands is kind of gone. It's mainly just single artists who have every other angle covered and have a massive social networking, social content network behind them. Do I shed a tear about that? No, not really. It doesn't really bother me, and that's the thing. Many of the documentaries discussing what happened to rock music, they all kind of end with this hopeful rock will be back kind of end to them, or final statement, and I don't believe that at all. In fact, it's not even what I would be worried about. It doesn't bother me at all that rock isn't in the mainstream. It had its moment in the 1970s, 1980s, and a variation of it in the 1990s, but it just doesn't fit into the way society or the way culture, I suppose popular culture, works anymore. There's also far less, there's no college rock radio anymore. The radio is kind of insignificant to what's online. Does anybody really log in online to listen to radio stations? There's a few, but not really. Kids certainly don't. The idea of the DJ, the cult of the DJ, that doesn't really exist anymore. All of the old outlets don't really exist anymore. And I think probably, as I said, there's some of the banal reasons are quite great. The gentrification of cities, so that there isn't, I mean, anecdotally, San Francisco, this happened to San Francisco. All the Silicon Valley people move into the cool area, which was full of all the crazy, cool gay bars and dive bars and all the rock and roll culture of San Francisco, and they just change it because that's actually not who they are, not what they want to live around. And they change those cities and famous venues disappear. The same thing happened in many cities. I mean, whether it's Berlin, Paris, Melbourne, London, of course they're still there, but people change as well. And, you know, you could build a really cool rock bar in Dublin, but would anyone go to it? I don't know. I think even after the recession in 2008, there was an awful lot of art spaces opened up, bring your own beer, kind of dive bar places. And the fact was that they weren't really that popular beyond the immediate people in a very small scene. Your average person kind of wasn't really that interested in them. And that's also one of the things you have to concede, which is market forces dictate. And market forces dictate, sadly, that there isn't a road of dive bars in Dublin that you can duck into one, duck into another, go and see a band here, go and see a band there. That's not really going to happen anymore. I don't think it will. And if it does, you get that kind of fake, modern, old, curated bar. We had a great bar in Dublin city centre, which had a rockabilly, psychobilly club on a Thursday where you could go and see bands upstairs. There was a Sunday was like a great old cool jazz band playing, old dudes playing in the basement or on the ground floor, and people outside drinking. And of course, it was bought over by corporate sponsors, and literally overnight just turned into, singer-songwriter, acoustic guitar, awful. What we have here is a mixture when you get these. They're not really trad musicians. They play variations of trad songs for tourists, mixed in with Wonderwall, mixed in with Ed Sheeran and even reggaeton stuff, all just aimed at this bland, monochrome demographic of young people who seem to think that constitutes live music, and of course tourists. And this is what sort of happens. The banality of the evil of multinational corporate oligarchy just invades your spaces and takes them for their own, and regurgitates a sort of variation on a theme, or just completely levels them. And so, like I said, there just isn't any dive bar space. Rents are too high. Anecdotally, I've said that about 5 times anecdotally. People I know who run bars, they've had very little rent or debt relief during this whole situation, or for the last 10 or 20 years. And that's, I think, something that you see across most of the West, most of Europe. Most big cities now would price out a small bar that at the basement might have 30, 40, 50 people venue, because it's being made into, luxury apartments or whatever else. So can it really come back? Can rock come back? I mean, look, AC/DC can still fill stadiums, and all the old legacy bands can still fill stadiums, but eventually those bands have to disappear. And who are they to be replaced by? Panic at the Disco? I don't know. I don't really even know what they sound like. Imagine Dragons, who would seem to be the top selling rock band of the last 10 years, who I've never heard of. I mean, look, they probably do big numbers, but at least anecdotally, as I said, in the mainstream, rock is a legacy thing. And while it can continue to flourish through underground to mid-sized touring and have its own festival season, who cares, really? Because society has changed, culture has changed. But certainly, rock doesn't have the teeth anymore. It doesn't have the danger. I mean, if Watain had managed to break through the boundaries to become the new Slipknot, then maybe. But all of our bands, they never really made it out the door in the same way. I mean, if you look at thrash metal, never sold what heavy metal before it did. Death metal never sold what thrash metal before it did. And then we're sort of stuck around the same place. There's new metal came through, burst through, sold tens of millions in a way that Slayers and Sepulturas never did, not of singular albums anyway. And now we're sort of in a position where we are left with our old legacy acts, and our bands have no purchase within the mainstream. Anyway, do we care? I don't care. Certainly not. However, anyway, episode 60. Did that make any sense? I don't know. I enjoyed talking about it, that's for sure, and mulling over the nature of rock. And I would advise going back and checking out some of those cool When Hair Rock Ruled the Sunset Strip documentaries and all that kind of thing. And there's lots of really interesting music documentaries about the 80s and the 90s. And you can watch some documentaries about what happened to rock in the 80s. There's definitely one recently I've been looking at, which is called the 80s Metal Recycle Bin, something like this on YouTube, which has interviews with lots of 80s hair metal guys, Warrant, Great White, all these kind of people. And almost to a man, they just discuss, 1992 came around and all our posters came down in the local record labels from the walls and in the stores, and they were replaced by pictures of Kurt Cobain in his jumper, and we kind of knew it was over. And that's really strange to me, because that means those bands often had a 7, 8, 9, 10-year career. And I look back and I go, wow, Primordial's 30 years, 29 years since we're 15, 16. Very strange, because if our career had those huge highs of 1 million copies and then down and out by within 7 or 8, 9 years, would have been very strange. But, Hair Metal Nation, all those kind of things. You can still go and see all of those ones. Dokken are still playing. Rat or Variations of Rat, and all these bands are still playing. They never kind of went away. The Sunset Strip Cockroaches just sort of kept going, kept around, and they enjoyed a resurgence in the last 10 years as a small percentage of young people resonated with it. Anyway, what am I talking about? Who knows? Episode 60, my friends, is just a kind of companion piece to the image of me as a teenage vampire, reenacting moments from a Wasp video, or Twisted Sister video, which happened quite often as a teenager. I suppose it was one a week, a variation on a theme. We're not going to take it, my friends, or we might, but just wake me up after noon. All right, episode 60, Agitators Anonymous. I am Alan Averill. Follow me on Instagram, nymphianga_primordial, etc., etc.